Before we dive into the analysis of the 2018 film The Hate You Give, we must take a look at context, author, and the book behind the film. First, some context. Racism, discrimination, and Black Lives Matter is not just something existing today, but comes from a long and difficult history dating all the way back to the early 17th century. It is possible that African American slaves and colonies already existed before 1619, but this is the first viable source we have confirming a ship from Europe carrying slaves from Africa. Slaves were forced to do hard manual labor and were sold off as property and not human beings. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was fought between the Union and the Confederacy, which represented the North and the South. A civil war that began when 11 southern states wanted to declare their independence from the Union. And the central cause of the war was the dispute over whether slavery was to be abolished. Abraham Lincoln became president, and one of the first things that he did was to abolish slavery. Still today, Americans reenact the American Civil War, and some still believe that the Confederacy should be protected. Abraham Lincoln remained president until he was killed in 1865. Despite of slavery being abolished, segregation and racism was still a major part of the American society. The founding of the Ku Klux Klan is an example of this, where they spread their white power, beating up blacks and hanging them from trees at night. In the first half of the 20th century, there are lots of examples of African Americans being treated poorly, like for example segregation in waiting rooms and on buses. Real change did not happen until the 1950s and 60s, with Rosa Parks being arrested for not giving up a seat on a bus when a white man wanted her seat in 1955, and Martin Luther King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," in 1963. The civil rights movement was a result of the reactions to Rosa Parks being arrested and 100 years of little to no change in society since slavery ended. The civil rights movement ended in 1968 with equal rights to all Americans, no matter what skin color. Equal rights, but that does not mean that the outcome is the same. After the 1960s, systemic racism has been present in the United States. These are systems and structures with procedures and processes that disadvantages African Americans. Systemic racism creates and enhances differences in society, and it involves all levels: healthcare, wealth, politics, education, and the criminal justice system. Systemic racism prevents or makes it more challenging for people of color to participate in society and in the economy. It is a fact that African Americans overrepresent inmates in American prisons, or that people of color are more likely to be pulled over by police. The civil rights movement Black Lives Matter are fighting for social justice for people of color and fighting structural racism. It is over 400 years ago since the first ship with slaves arrived in North America. Over 150 years since slavery was abolished, and over 50 years since the civil rights movement, which secured equal rights. But structural racism and discrimination against people of color is still a major problem in the American society. Another important element to mention here is gun control and the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Gun control is a political issue, and the access to guns is a vital part of the problem. Gun statistics show that close to 50% of the US population live in a household with a gun, and that there are more guns than citizens in the United States. Guns are the #1 cause of death for Americans between the age of 1 and 19. And these gun statistics affect racial profiling done by the police. Racial profiling is the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone having committed an offense. The United States also has a rule of stop and frisk, which also allows police to stop and pat down anyone they suspect of may be committing, have committed, or about to commit a crime. Combine racial profiling and the stop and frisk, and then we can see how these two contributes highly to the structural racism in the American society. Okay, so now we have placed the film at the end of a long and difficult history and given context to why this film is important. Now, let us take a look at the author and the book. The Hate U Give is a novel written by Angie Thomas, published in 2017. Notice how this is only 1 year before the film was released, which shows the importance of both the book and the film being published. The Hate U Give is a young adult novel, which the author herself explains in interviews was inspired by the killing of Oscar Grant in 2009 and the Black Lives Matter movement. Thomas explains that Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin and Black Lives Matter made her think about what would happen if something like that happened in her own neighborhood, and she was fueled by frustration and anger. She views her book as her own form of activism, because it can show us a side of the world that we might not have known about. She wanted to show the human side of these cases, and as a way to find hope. The book was actually banned from libraries in Texas for a short time because of the language used in the novel. Thomas was accused of promoting an anti-police agenda, which is a good example of how some people might see something different than others when interpreting a book. So, a brief history and a context to the film. Here is an overview.